My grandmother died with a secret, not the kind you'd expect. No hidden money, no buried treasure, just a small notebook she never told anyone about, hidden in the back of her linen closet, behind the good towels nobody was allowed to use. I found it 3 months after her funeral. Inside were 25 recipes, handwritten, stained with grease and time. Some of the pages were stuck together. Some of the ink had faded so much I could barely read it. But every single recipe started the same way. Put it in the crockpot, walk away, let it work. These weren't the recipes she taught me. These were the ones she kept for herself. The shortcuts, the tricks, the meals that got her through the hard days when nobody was watching. And by the time you reach number 25, you're going to understand why she hid them. Because these aren't just recipes, they're survival. 1. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes. This was the first recipe in the notebook, and next to it, my grandmother wrote one word. Sunday. Pot roast wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. You'd wake up on a Sunday morning, toss a big hunk of beef into the crockpot, add carrots, potatoes, a little onion, some salt, maybe a splash of water. Then you'd go to church, come home, and the whole house smelled like heaven. The meat would fall apart with a fork. The potatoes soaked up all that beefy flavor. And the carrots? Soft, sweet, perfect. But here's what I didn't know until I read the margins. My grandmother made this every single Sunday for 43 years. Same recipe, same pot, same ritual. Because my grandfather worked 6 days a week in a factory, and Sunday pot roast was the only meal they ate together as a family. It wasn't just dinner. It was the one thing that stayed the same when everything else kept changing. This was the meal that said, "You're home," and every grandmother knew how to make it. 2. Beef stew with turnips. Right under the pot roast recipe, there was another one. Beef stew, but this one had a twist. Turnips. Now, a lot of people today don't cook with turnips, but back then, turnips were cheap. They lasted through the winter, and they added a little bite to the stew that made it feel different. My grandmother's note said, "Make on Mondays with Sunday's leftovers." She didn't waste anything. If there was beef left from the roast, it went into the stew. If there were vegetables in the fridge, they went in too. And you know what? It tasted even better the second day. But there was another note, written in pencil, almost erased. It said, "Made this the week Jim lost his job." Jim was my grandfather, and I never knew they went through hard times, because my grandmother never let us see it. She just made stew, fed the family, and kept moving forward. That's what turnips meant to her. Survival dressed up as dinner. 3. Pork chops in mushroom gravy. This one had a heart drawn next to it. I'm not kidding. A little heart, in blue ink. Pork chops in mushroom gravy. My grandfather's favorite. She made it every time he had a hard week at work, or when money was tight, or when she just wanted to see him smile. The chops would cook all day in a thick, creamy mushroom sauce, and when you cut into them, they were so tender you didn't even need a knife, just a fork and a piece of white bread to soak up the gravy. Here's the thing about this recipe. It only cost about $3 to make. My grandmother wrote the price at the top. $3 feeds 4 people with leftovers. And next to that, she wrote something else. He doesn't know how broke we are. That hit me hard, because I remember my grandfather bragging about this meal, telling people my grandmother made the best pork chops in town. He had no idea she was stretching every dollar just to put it on the table. This wasn't just dinner. It was comfort. It was care. It was love on a plate. But the next recipe? That one surprised me. 4. Chicken and dumplings. I didn't know my grandmother made chicken and dumplings in a crockpot. I always thought it was a stovetop thing. But there it was, written in her handwriting, with a note that said, "Easier this way." She'd throw chicken thighs into the pot, add broth, carrots, celery, let it cook for hours. Then, at the very end, she'd drop in the dumplings, soft, fluffy, like little clouds floating in the broth. This was the meal she made when someone was sick, when the weather turned cold, When you needed something that felt like a hug from the inside, and it worked every time. But I found something else in the margins. A date. February 1978. And next to it she wrote, "Made this for Jenny when she had the flu." Jenny was my mom, and I called her to ask about it. She remembered. She said my grandmother brought a whole pot of chicken and dumplings to her apartment, stayed with her all night, fed her soup and held her hand. That's what this recipe really was. Medicine, comfort, a way to say, "I'm here," without saying anything at all. 5. Swiss steak in tomato sauce. Swiss steak sounds fancy, but it's not. It's just cheap cuts of beef, pounded flat, cooked slow in tomato sauce until they're so tender they melt in your mouth. My grandmother's recipe had a note at the bottom. Serve with mashed potatoes. Because the sauce was too good to waste, you needed something to soak it up. This was the kind of meal that stretched $1, that fed a family, that made you feel full and happy even when times were tough. And there was a little story written at the top. "First meal I made for Jim's parents. His mother said it was too simple. I made it again the next week." My grandmother wasn't the type to talk back, but she knew how to prove a point. She made that Swiss steak so good that my great-grandmother asked for the recipe. Never admitted she was wrong, but she asked for the recipe. That's power. That's confidence. That's knowing your worth even when nobody else sees it. And speaking of stretching $1, the next one might be the most genius recipe in the whole notebook. 6. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. Meatloaf in a crockpot. I know, it sounds weird, but hear me out. My grandmother would shape the meatloaf into a loaf, wrap it in foil, set it in the crockpot with a little water at the bottom. Then she'd brush the top with ketchup mixed with brown sugar and let it cook all day. The result? Moist, flavorful, with a sweet, tangy glaze that made you want seconds. She'd slice it up, serve it with green beans and mashed potatoes, and there'd be enough left over for sandwiches the next day. 1 meal, 2 days. That's how grandmothers thought. But here's what made this recipe different. At the bottom, she wrote, "Add oatmeal when meat is expensive." Oatmeal, not breadcrumbs. Oatmeal, because it was cheaper, and it stretched the meat further. I did the math. A pound of ground beef could feed 6 people if you added enough oatmeal. Nobody knew. Nobody tasted the difference. They just ate, and smiled, and asked for more. That's not just cooking. That's strategy. That's making sure your family never goes hungry, even when the budget says they should. 7. Stuffed bell peppers. This recipe had the most notes. Cut tops off. Scoop out seeds. Stand them up so they don't fall. Stuffed bell peppers were a project, but the crockpot made them easy. You'd fill the peppers with ground beef, rice, tomato sauce, and a little cheese. Then you'd nestle them into the pot, add a splash of water, and let them cook until the peppers were soft and the filling was perfect. This was the meal my grandmother made when she wanted to impress someone, a neighbor, a visiting relative, someone from church, because it looked fancy, but it was still simple, still humble, still made with love. And at the bottom of the page there was a note that made me smile. "Made these for the pastor. He asked if I went to culinary school. I said no, I just have a crockpot and good timing." That's the thing about my grandmother. She never bragged, never showed off, but she knew what she was doing, and she knew that presentation mattered just as much as taste. These peppers weren't just food, they were proof that you didn't need money to have class. 8. Beef stroganoff. Beef stroganoff, creamy, rich, with tender strips of beef and mushrooms swimming in a sour cream sauce. My grandmother didn't use fancy cuts of meat. She used whatever was on sale. But after 8 hours in the crockpot, it didn't matter. The beef was so tender it fell apart. She'd serve it over egg noodles, and the whole family would gather around the table. Nobody talked much. They were too busy eating. This was the meal that made weeknights feel special. But there was something written in the margin that stopped me cold. Made this the night before Jim's surgery. Wanted him to have something good to remember. My grandfather had heart surgery in 1985. I was too young to remember. But my grandmother remembered, and she wanted his last meal before the hospital to be something warm, something comforting, something that tasted like home. He made it through the surgery, lived another 20 years, and every time she made stroganoff after that, he'd smile and say, "That's my lucky meal." Food isn't just food. Sometimes it's hope, sometimes it's a prayer, sometimes it's the only thing you can control when everything else is falling apart. 9. Ham and bean soup. Ham and bean soup. The ultimate leftover meal. After Easter, after Thanksgiving, after any holiday with a ham. My grandmother would take the bone, throw it in the crockpot with dried beans, onions, and a bay leaf, and let it simmer all day. By dinner time the beans were creamy, the broth was smoky and rich, and the house smelled like a memory. She'd serve it with cornbread, and there was always enough to freeze for later. But here's what I learned from the notebook. This wasn't just about using leftovers, this was about making the most expensive meal of the year last as long as possible. A holiday ham cost a lot of money, but if you used the bone for soup, you could stretch that one ham into 3 more meals, maybe 4. And nobody felt like they were eating leftovers, because ham and bean soup tasted better than the ham itself. My grandmother wrote at the top, 1 ham, 4 meals, that's how you make it to next payday. That's not just frugal, that's genius. But the next recipe? That one tells a different story. 10. Corned beef and cabbage. Corned beef and cabbage. The meal my grandmother made every St. Patrick's Day. Even though we weren't Irish, she'd put the corned beef brisket in the crockpot with the spice packet, add cabbage wedges, potatoes, carrots, and let it cook all day while we were at school. When we came home, the whole house smelled like salt and spice and something a little funky in the best way. This wasn't about being Irish. It was about tradition, about doing something the same way every year, about building memories one meal at a time. But there's a note at the bottom of the recipe, and it says, started making this in 1962, the year we moved to the new house, wanted to start new traditions. See, my grandparents moved a lot when they were young, chasing work, chasing better opportunities, and my grandmother said she got tired of feeling like they didn't belong anywhere. So she started making corned beef and cabbage every March 17th. Same recipe, same day, no matter where they lived, because if you do something long enough, it stops being borrowed. It becomes yours. That's what this recipe really is. A way to plant roots, a way to say, this is home now. 11. Pulled pork with vinegar sauce. Pulled pork, smoky, tender, falling apart in shreds. My grandmother's version wasn't fancy. No fancy rubs, no liquid smoke, just pork shoulder, salt, pepper, and a vinegar-based sauce she'd make from scratch. After 10 hours in the crockpot, you could pull the pork apart with 2 forks, pile it on a bun, add a little coleslaw, and that was dinner. This was the meal she made for summer cookouts, church potlucks, any time she needed to feed a crowd without breaking the bank, and people always asked for the recipe. But here's the part I didn't know. My grandmother grew up in North Carolina, and pulled pork with vinegar sauce? That's a North Carolina thing. It's the way they've been making it for generations. At the top of the recipe, she wrote, Mama's Way. That's it. 2 words. But those 2 words meant everything, because this wasn't just pulled pork. This was a connection to her mother, to her childhood, to the place she came from. And every time she made it, she was bringing a little piece of North Carolina to wherever she was, sharing it, passing it on. 12. Chicken cacciatore. Chicken cacciatore. It sounds Italian, and it is, but it's also the kind of dish grandmothers made because it was cheap and filling and tasted like you spent all day cooking. Chicken thighs, tomatoes, bell peppers, onions, garlic, a little oregano, all thrown into the crockpot and left to simmer until the chicken was tender and the sauce was thick and rich. She'd serve it over pasta, or rice, or just with a hunk of bread to soak up the sauce. This was the meal that made you feel like you were sitting in a little Italian kitchen, even if you were in the middle of Ohio, and there's a story written in the margins. Learned this from Mrs. DeLuca next door. She didn't speak much English. I didn't speak Italian, but we cooked together every Thursday for 2 years. Mrs. DeLuca was my grandmother's neighbor in the 1960s, an immigrant from Sicily, and my grandmother said they became best friends without ever having a full conversation. They'd stand in the kitchen, pointing, gesturing, tasting, laughing, and somehow they understood each other perfectly. This recipe isn't just Italian food, it's proof that food is a language all by itself, and sometimes it's the only language you need. 13. Chili con carne. Chili. The recipe every grandmother had, and every grandmother claimed was the best. My grandmother's version was simple: ground beef, kidney beans, tomatoes, onions, chili powder, a little cumin, and a secret ingredient she never told anyone about. I found out later it was a tablespoon of cocoa powder. It didn't make the chili taste like chocolate. It just made it taste deeper, richer, more complex. She'd make a huge pot, serve it with cornbread and shredded cheese, and there'd be leftovers for days. This was the meal that brought people together. But at the top of the recipe, there's a note. Made this for the church fundraiser, 1971. Sold out in 20 minutes. They asked me to make it every year after that. For 15 years, my grandmother made chili for the church fundraiser. Same recipe, same giant pot. And every year, people lined up before the doors even opened. She never charged extra, never raised the price, just made the best chili she could, and gave all the money to the church. That's the thing about this recipe. It wasn't about winning. It was about serving, about using what you're good at to help other people. And that's a lesson you can't learn from a cookbook. But the next one? That one's a little messy. And that's the point. 14. Sloppy Joes. Sloppy Joes, the meal every kid loved, because it was messy and fun, and tasted like a burger that didn't have to follow the rules. My grandmother would brown the ground beef on the stove, then toss it in the crockpot with ketchup, mustard, brown sugar, and a little vinegar. Let it cook for hours until the sauce was thick and sticky. She'd pile it on hamburger buns, serve it with potato chips, and hand you a stack of napkins. This wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was fun, it was easy, and it made everyone happy. And there's a note at the bottom. Kids' favorite. Made this every Friday for 10 years. Every Friday for 10 years. That's over 500 Sloppy Joe dinners. Why Fridays? Because my grandmother knew the end of the week was hard. Everyone was tired, everyone was cranky, and the last thing anyone wanted was a complicated meal. So she made it easy, she made it fun, and she turned Friday nights into something the whole family looked forward to. That's not just cooking, that's understanding. That's knowing what people need before they even ask for it. 15. Short ribs in red wine. Short ribs. The fanciest thing in the notebook. My grandmother only made this on special occasions. Anniversaries, birthdays. When she wanted to remind my grandfather why he married her, she'd sear the ribs on the stove, then put them in the crock-pot with red wine, carrots, onions, and fresh thyme. Let them cook all day until the meat fell off the bone and the sauce was so rich you wanted to drink it. This was the meal that proved you didn't need a fancy restaurant. You just needed time, and a crock-pot, and a grandmother who knew what she was doing. But here's the twist. At the bottom of the recipe, she wrote, "Only make this when you have something to celebrate. Don't waste good wine on a Tuesday." That made me laugh, because it's so true. My grandmother knew the difference between everyday meals and special meals, and she treated them differently. Short ribs weren't for Tuesdays. They were for moments that mattered, for anniversaries and achievements and milestones, and by saving this recipe for special occasions, she made those occasions even more special. That's not just about food. That's about honoring the moment, about making memories that stick. 16. Turkey breast with herb butter. Turkey wasn't just for Thanksgiving. My grandmother would buy a turkey breast when it was on sale, rub it with butter mixed with sage, rosemary, and thyme, put it in the crock pot, and let it cook all day. By dinner time, the turkey was juicy and tender. The skin wasn't crispy, but nobody cared, because the flavor was perfect. She'd slice it up, serve it with mashed potatoes and gravy, and it felt like a holiday even when it wasn't. And there's a note in the margin. Made this in July once. Kids asked if it was Thanksgiving. I said every day can be Thanksgiving if you want it to be. That's the thing about my grandmother. She didn't wait for permission to celebrate. She didn't need a special day on the calendar to make a special meal. If turkey was on sale, she made turkey. And she made it feel like an event, because she understood something a lot of people forget. You don't need a reason to make someone feel special. You just need to decide to do it. And that's what this recipe really is. A reminder that ordinary days can be extraordinary if you treat them that way. 17. Beef and noodles. Beef and noodles, the ultimate comfort food. My grandmother would take a cheap cut of beef, cook it in the crockpot with beef broth and onions until it was fall-apart tender. Then she'd add egg noodles at the end. Let them soak up all that beefy goodness. This was the meal she made on cold nights, when you came home from school and your fingers were numb, when you needed something warm and filling and simple, and it worked every time. But there's a note at the top of the recipe. Reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen. She made this every winter. See, this recipe didn't start with my grandmother. It came from her grandmother, and probably her grandmother before that, and now it's mine. That's the thing about recipes like this. They get passed down, generation after generation. Each person adds their own little twist, their own little note, their own memory. And by the time it gets to you, it's not just a recipe anymore. It's a family tree, written in butter and beef broth and love. This isn't just beef and noodles. It's history. It's connection. It's proof that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. 18. Pork tenderloin with apples. Pork and apples, sweet and savory. The perfect fall meal. My grandmother would put a pork tenderloin in the crockpot with sliced apples, onions, and a little brown sugar. Let it cook all day until the pork was tender and the apples were soft and caramelized. This was the meal that smelled like autumn, like crisp air and falling leaves and everything good about the season. She'd serve it with roasted sweet potatoes, and everyone would ask for seconds, and there's a story written in blue ink at the bottom. First meal I made after we bought the farmhouse. Apples came from the tree in the backyard. My grandparents had a farmhouse for about 5 years in the 1970s. I never saw it. They sold it before I was born. But my grandmother talked about it sometimes. She said they had an apple tree, and every fall it would drop so many apples they didn't know what to do with them all. So she made pork with apples, apple pie, applesauce, apple butter, anything she could think of. And this recipe? This was her favorite, because it took something free, something she didn't have to pay for, and turned it into a meal that felt like a gift. That's not just cooking. That's gratitude. That's seeing abundance in your own backyard. But the next recipe? That one takes patience. 19. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Stuffed cabbage rolls. The recipe that took the most work, but was worth every second. My grandmother would blanch cabbage leaves, fill them with ground beef, rice, and tomato sauce, roll them up like little packages, then nestle them into the crock-pot and let them cook for hours. This was the meal she made when she had time, when she wanted to do something special, when she wanted to remind us that some things can't be rushed. And when you bit into one of those rolls, you understood why. The cabbage was soft, the filling was rich and savory, the sauce soaked into every bite, and it tasted like patience, like care, like someone who wasn't in a hurry. At the top of the recipe, she wrote, "Mama's recipe." She made these every Sunday after church. My great-grandmother was Polish, and stuffed cabbage rolls are a Polish tradition. They take time, they take effort, but they're worth it. And my grandmother kept that tradition alive, even when her own kids didn't want to learn, even when nobody seemed to care. She made them anyway, because some things are too important to let go. This isn't just food, it's heritage, it's identity, it's refusing to forget where you came from. 20. Sausage and peppers, sausage and peppers, simple, colorful, delicious. Italian sausage, bell peppers, onions, a little marinara sauce, all thrown into the crock-pot and cooked until the sausage was juicy and the peppers were soft and sweet. She'd serve it on hoagie rolls, or over pasta, or just by itself with a piece of bread. This was the meal she made when she didn't feel like thinking, when she needed something easy, when she wanted something that tasted like it took more effort than it did. And there's a note scribbled at the bottom. Made this the night the power went out. Crockpot stayed warm for 3 hours after. Saved dinner. That's the thing about crockpots. They hold heat. They keep cooking even when the power cuts off. And my grandmother knew that. She planned for it. She was ready. Because when you've lived through hard times, you learn to expect the unexpected. You learn to have backup plans. You learn that sometimes the simplest tools are the most reliable. This recipe isn't about sausage and peppers. It's about resilience. It's about adapting. It's about making sure your family eats no matter what life throws at you. 21. Brisket with onions. Brisket, the meal my grandmother made for Jewish holidays. Even though we weren't Jewish, she'd rub the brisket with salt and pepper, layer it with sliced onions, add a little beef broth, and let it cook all day until the meat was so tender it fell apart. This was the meal that taught me that food doesn't belong to one culture. It belongs to anyone willing to cook it with love. And at the top of the page, there's a note. Learned this from Ruth at the hospital. She said food is how we remember. Ruth was a nurse my grandmother worked with in the 1960s, a Jewish woman who grew up in Brooklyn, and she taught my grandmother how to make brisket the way her own mother made it. My grandmother never forgot. And every Passover, even though we didn't celebrate it, she'd make brisket, and she'd think of Ruth. Because food isn't just about eating. It's about connection. It's about honoring the people who taught you. It's about keeping their memory alive one meal at a time. This isn't my grandmother's recipe. It's Ruth's. But my grandmother loved it enough to write it down, to make it, to pass it on. And now it's ours too. 22. Lamb shanks with rosemary. Lamb shanks. The fanciest thing you could make in a crock-pot. My grandmother would brown the lamb shanks on the stove, then put them in the crock-pot with garlic, rosemary, red wine, and tomatoes. Let them cook all day until the meat fell off the bone. This was the meal she made when she wanted to show off, when she wanted people to know she could cook, when she wanted to prove that fancy didn't mean difficult. And it worked. But there's a story written in pencil at the bottom. Made this for Jim's boss in 1973. Got invited to the company dinner for the first time. My grandfather worked in a factory for 30 years, and for most of those years, he wasn't invited to the company dinners. Those were for managers, executives, people higher up the ladder. But one year, his boss came to the house for dinner, and my grandmother made lamb shanks. The next week, my grandfather got an invitation to the company dinner, and a raise. Did the lamb shanks do that? Maybe, maybe not. But my grandmother believed they did, and she wrote it down, because sometimes a meal isn't just a meal. Sometimes it's an opportunity, sometimes it's a chance to change your life. 23. Chicken and rice casserole. Chicken and rice casserole. The one-pot wonder. Chicken thighs, long-grain rice, cream of mushroom soup, chicken broth, a little onion, all mixed together in the crock-pot and cooked until the rice was fluffy and the chicken was tender. This was the meal she made when she was tired, when she didn't want to think, when she just needed dinner on the table. And somehow, it always tasted better than it had any right to. There's a note at the bottom. Made this 127 times in 1982. 127 times. In 1 year. That's more than twice a week. Why? Because 1982 was the year my grandfather got laid off, and money was so tight they couldn't afford variety. They couldn't afford experiments. So my grandmother made what worked, what was cheap, what filled everyone up without costing too much. And she counted. She kept track, because she needed to know they were going to make it through. This recipe isn't about chicken and rice. It's about survival. It's about doing what you have to do when you don't have other options. And it's about the quiet strength it takes to make the same meal twice a week and still put a smile on your face when you serve it. 24. BBQ beef. Sandwiches. BBQ beef sandwiches. The meal my grandmother made for every summer gathering. Chuck roast, BBQ sauce, a little brown sugar. Let it cook all day until the beef shredded with a fork. She'd pile it on hamburger buns, serve it with potato salad and baked beans, and people would go back for thirds. This was the meal that made everyone happy. That fed a crowd. That proved you didn't need a grill to make great BBQ. And there's a date written at the top, July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial. My grandmother hosted a huge backyard party that day. 50 people, maybe more. And she made BBQ beef sandwiches for all of them. She wrote, "Easiest meal I ever made for that many people." Because the Crockpot did all the work. She just set it up in the morning and walked away. And everyone raved, everyone asked how she did it, and she just smiled and said, "It's all about the timing." That's the secret to Crockpot cooking. It's not about skill. It's not about fancy ingredients. It's about planning ahead, about letting time do the work for you. And my grandmother understood that better than anyone. 25. Bread, pudding with raisins. And finally, the last recipe in the notebook, bread pudding. My grandmother made this on Sunday nights, when there was stale bread that needed to be used, when she wanted something sweet but didn't want to turn on the oven. She'd tear the bread into chunks, soak it in milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla. Add raisins, a little cinnamon, pour it all into the crock-pot, and let it cook until it was warm and custardy and perfect. She'd serve it with a drizzle of cream, or a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and it tasted like childhood, like safety, like home. But at the very bottom of the page, there's one last note, written in shaky handwriting, like she added it years later. It says, "This was the last thing I made before Jim died. He had 2 bowls. My grandfather died in 2003, and I didn't know this was his last meal. My grandmother never told me. She just kept making bread pudding, every Sunday, for another 12 years, until she couldn't anymore." This recipe isn't about bread pudding. It's about memory. It's about holding on to the people you love, even after they're gone. It's about making the same recipe over and over because it keeps them close, because it reminds you of their smile, their laugh, the way they asked for seconds. Food doesn't bring people back, but it keeps them alive in a way nothing else can. 25 recipes, 25 memories. My grandmother hid this notebook because she thought nobody would care. She thought her meals were too simple, too ordinary. But she was wrong. These recipes weren't just food. They were love. They were survival. They were 50 years of showing up every single day and doing what needed to be done. And now they're yours. So pick one. Make it this week. And when you do, think about the person who taught you what real cooking looks like. Then write it down. Start your own notebook. Because 50 years from now, someone's going to find it. And they're going to understand. Drop a comment and tell me which recipe you're making first. And hit subscribe because I've got a whole drawer full of notebooks and a whole lot more stories to tell.